Salam, peace be upon you. I am Mohammed Layiq Sediqi, the father of Holophase. We continue our journey through the epistemic firewall, arriving at a cornerstone function, grammar. This is the mechanism that stands between us and a profound seductive failure, the mistake of a random pile of facts for a lawful world. The skill you will cultivate here is the disciplined ability to distinguish a genuine constraint of reality from a mere coincidence of observations. You will learn to interrogate any perceived pattern with a fundamental question. Is this a rule or just a pile of sentences? Our guiding star for this part is a single, sharp inquiry. What distinguishes a pile of sentences from a lawful world? The answer does not reside in the sentences themselves, in their specific content, their elegance, or their number. It resides in the constraints that bind them. A pile of bricks is not a house. It lacks the relational logic of architecture. A list of words is not a language. It lacks the syntax that generates meaning. A collection of phi sentences, our licensed reconstructions of reality's pattern, is not a physics. What transmutes a pile into a world is grammar. Grammar is the set of constraints that sentences must satisfy to be considered admissible within a given domain of reality. It is not a description of what happens. It is a definition of what cannot be violated without inconsistency. Grammar is the prison of the possible. It draws the boundary within which coherent reality can manifest. Let me now state the audio equation that formalizes this, then unpack it symbol by symbol. We define a grammar is a constraint family such that for all licensed windows, admissible sentences satisfy. G phi equal to 0 or G phi less than equal to 0 within the uncertainty bounds delta of the reconstruction. Let us decode this. G is the grammar operator. It is a rule, often a mathematical function, that takes as its input the reconstructed phi field and its derivatives, the jet phi, within a window. Its output is a number. Phi represents the specific pattern reconstruction, the sentence we have measured or inferred. The condition G phi is going to 0 or less than equal to 0 is the grammaticality test. If the output is 0 or non-positive within the margin of uncertainty delta, the sentence is grammatically admissible. It is a valid utterance in this world's language. If the output is positive and significantly outside delta, the sentence is grammatically forbidden. It describes an arrangement that this universe's rules deem inconsistent. This is not a suggestion of a heuristic. It is the firewall's filter. Why this filter is necessary? The illusion of law from accident. The failure mode this definition prevents is primordial. The illusion of law arising from accident. Human minds are relentless pattern seekers. We are wired to see agency in the wind, faces in the clouds, and rules in 3 consecutive events. Without a strict operational definition and test for grammar, we would perpetually fill our textbooks with imagined constraints that are merely local coincidences, cultural conventions, or artifacts of our measurement procedures. The firewall must possess a discriminator that can separate real, binding constraints from statistical flukes and procedural habits. To grasp this, consider a tangible example from the cultural fabric of Afghanistan. Imagine yourself in the bustling, sun-drenched labyrinth of the Kandahar bazaar. Before you lies a magnificent pile of hand-woven carpets, a riot of crimson, indigo, and gold. A pile, however beautiful, is just a collection. But if you look with the eye of a master weaver, you see beyond the individual pieces. You perceive the deeper constraints, the precise radial symmetry of the central medallion, the strict hierarchy of borders within borders, the exacting knotting technique, the Turkish or Persian knot, that gives the carpet its density and durability. These are not descriptions of any single carpet's imagery. They are the rules that make a carpet recognizably a product of that centuries-old tradition. A pattern that violates these rules, say a chaotic, asymmetrical splash of color with no structural integrity, would be rejected by the master as not a carpet of this kind. It might be fabric, but it is not an admissible sentence in the language of this craft. The grammar of the tradition is what separates a mere pile of individual textiles from the lawful, coherent world of that weaving art. It defines what cannot be done if the object is to belong to that category. In the Holophase framework, our carpets are fee sentences. Each sentence is a specific licensed reconstruction of phi and its derivatives, omega, k, v, within a window. The grammar G is the constraint family that all admissible sentences must obey. Crucially, it operates on the tri-unity, omega, temporal cadence, k, spatial structure, and v, propagative motion, jointly. A true grammar never constrains only time, or only space, or only motion in isolation. It constrains their relationship. The formal nature of grammar, constraining the tri-unity. Let us make this formal. A grammar G is a function of phi and its derivatives. Since these derivatives encode the voices of the tri-unity, phi over tt relates to omega, phi relates to k, and their combination gives v, the grammar is ultimately a constraint on the permissible relationships between omega, k, and v. For example, a simple fundamental grammar could be v minus omega par k equals 0 within delta. This constraint links the three voices directly. The speed of propagation is forced to be the ratio of temporal frequency to spatial wave number. This is a grammar of simple, non-dispersive waves. A more complex grammar might be del squared phi over del t squared minus c squared, del squared phi equals 0. This is the wave equation, a constraint on the second derivatives. It dictates how the pattern's acceleration, related to omega squared, must be proportional to its spatial curvature, related to k squared. The pivotal point is that grammar is inherently relational. It does not say omega must be 10 Hz. That would be a specific sentence, a particular note. It says, whatever omega is, it must stand in this exact mathematical relationship to the corresponding k and v. Grammar is the rule that harmonizes the echoes of reality. The operational protocol, discovering and testing grammar. How then do we, as epistemic engineers, discover and test the grammar? The firewall mandates a disciplined four-step protocol. First, curation. You must possess a collection of licensed phi sentences gathered from varied but controlled conditions. A grammar cannot be proposed from a single sentence or a single type of window. You need multiple instances, a robust dataset of reality's utterances. Second, conjecture. You propose a candidate constraint family, G. You hypothesize a mathematical relationship that all these sentences appear to obey. Third, perturbation, the firewall core. This step is non-negotiable. You must perturb the system. You deliberately alter initial conditions, modify boundary parameters, or push the experimental setup into a new regime, slightly outside the range of your initial observations. You then take new measurements, creating new licensed windows. Fourth, validation, falsification. You check if the new sentences still satisfy G phi equals 0 within delta. If they do, the grammar holds under perturbation. It demonstrates stability, a key signature of a real constraint. If the new sentences violate the constraint robustly, the grammar fails. A rule that only holds for the exact set of sentences you first observed is not a grammar of nature. It is a coincidental description of that specific setup. A real grammar must possess scope. It must govern sentences you have not yet measured, under conditions you have not yet tried. Let us illustrate perturbation and stability with another selective analogy from Afghanistan. Consider the ancient Carez irrigation systems, the underground channels that bring water from mountain aquifers to arid fields. The grammar of a functional Carez is not water flows in channel A. That is a sentence, an observation. The grammar is the set of constraints that enable flow, the meticulously calculated constant downhill slope of the tunnel, precise enough for flow, gentle enough to prevent erosion. The structural integrity of the lined walls, the strategic placement of vertical access shafts for maintenance. If you understand this grammar, you can make a prediction. If you introduce water at a new upstream access point, a perturbation, it will still flow downhill to the fields, obeying the same slope constraints. The grammar predicts stability under that change. If you pour water in and it pulls, flows backward, or causes a collapse, the grammar has been falsified. Your understanding of the slope or the wall integrity was wrong. The supposed rule was not a true constraint of the system. It was an artifact of only observing water at the familiar outlet. Energy as the tally of grammatical coherence. Within the Holophase model, the role of energy here is critical. Recall, energy is not a substance. It is a tally, an accounting output of omega pay minus v coherence. When we speak of violating a grammar, what does this mean energetically? It means attempting to force a phi sentence where omega, k, and v do not satisfy the constraint g. The accounting ledger cannot close. The numbers for energy and momentum become divergent, infinite, or mathematically undefined. It is not that you need more energy to break the rule. It is that the very concept of a coherent, finite tally for that forbidden configuration breaks down. The ledger screams in protest because the three voices are trying to sing in a relationship that is not just difficult, but fundamentally inadmissible. Imagine a village's traditional accounting system for the annual harvest. The grammar of equitable distribution might be each family's share must be proportional to the area of land they cultivated, within a small tolerance for rounding and community support. If a leader tries to assign shares that wildly violate this proportion, giving one family an amount that far exceeds what their land could possibly yield, the ledger does not merely show a deficit. The very categories of the ledger break down. Trust, the social energy of cooperation, evaporates. The system cannot function because the foundational constraint of fairness has been violated. The violation is not expensive, it is nonsensical within that social grammar. Deepening the formalism. Grammar acts on the jet of phi. Mathematically, a grammar operates on the jet of phi, denoted Jn phi, which includes phi itself and its partial derivatives up to some order n. This is essential because it allows grammar to constrain not just static values, but rates of change, curvatures, and higher order patterns. Newton's second law, F equals ma, is a grammar constraining the second time derivative of position, acceleration, relative to force. In Holophase, position is a pattern in phi, and acceleration is a higher derivative. Thus, the grammar constrains how these higher derivatives relate. Since the triunity, omega kv, is embedded within these derivatives, any fundamental grammar, G, must constrain them jointly. A constraint on omega alone, for example, all oscillations must have frequency 1 Hz, is physically incomplete and meaningless as a fundamental rule. Why? Because a frequency detached from a specific spatial structure, K, and the propagation law, V, does not define a physically admissible pattern. The oscillation could be a vibration of a string, a light wave, or a business cycle. The physics, the real grammar, is in how that omega couples to a particular K and V for that specific medium. A legal cadence must be compatible with a legal spatial structure and a legal motion, always together. The firewall's epistemic function, blocking reification. The firewall role of this concept is to block a specific and pernicious epistemic failure. reifying a correlation as a cause. We constantly observe persistent patterns. The sun rises every morning. But is "the sun must rise every 24 hours" a grammar of the universe? No. It is a single persistent sentence from our particular vantage point on a rotating planet in a stable orbit. The real grammar is the constraint family of orbital mechanics, a set of relationships between angular momentum, gravitational attraction, and distance, all expressible in terms of phi patterns and their derivatives, that yield stable, periodic solutions. The sunrise is a magnificent recurring instance. The laws of gravitation and motion are the grammar. The firewall forces us to search for the constraint family that generates the instances, not to worship the instances as constraints themselves. Allowed and forbidden actions. What assumptions and actions are permitted or barred by this firewall mechanism? You may hypothesize a constraint family G as a candidate grammar. You may test it by checking existing sentences and, crucially, by performing controlled perturbations to see if new sentences remain admissible. You may assign it a provisional license with the explicitly specified scope, for example, valid for macroscopic mechanical systems at speeds much less than c. You may not declare a grammar based solely on elegance, mathematical beauty, philosophical preference, or scholarly consensus without rigorous testing against perturbed sentences. You may not ignore or dismiss sentences that violate G as noise or exceptions without first conducting a rigorous audit of the window licenses and uncertainty budgets. You may not apply a grammar beyond its proven scope without explicit extension and new validation. Explicit prediction and falsification. The beating heart of the epistemic mechanism is the explicit statement of prediction and falsification criteria for grammar. Prediction, the signature of a real grammar. If a proposed grammar G captures a true constraint of reality, then under small, controlled perturbations, the system will demonstrate stability. Specifically, if you push the system slightly out of a grammatically correct state, create a sentence that minimally violates G, and then release it, the subsequent evolution, the new sentences, will show the pattern relaxing back to a state that obeys G phi equals 0 within delta. The triunity will reassert itself according to the rule. For a simple harmonic oscillator, a spring, the grammar is G d square x by dt squared plus k per m or x equals 0. The prediction is that if you stretch and release it, perturbation, the subsequent omega, frequency of oscillation, and the associated spatial displacement pattern, linked to k, will maintain a fixed relationship defined by the spring constant and mass. The motion v, velocity, will be precisely slave to this omega per k relation. This return to grammaticality is the stability we predict. Falsification, the exposure of a pseudogrammar. If repeated, licensed observations yield phi sentences that robustly violate the supposed constraint G. And these sentences are themselves coherent, admissible, and do not lead to any system breakdown or return to the rule, then the proposed grammar is falsified. It was a convention, an artifact of a particular setup, or a statistical coincidence. The falsifying observation is the comfortable, stable existence of sentences that live outside G, not as fleeting errors, but as repeatable, licensed facts of reality. Let's illustrate falsification. Suppose anthropologists study the traditional Kochi migration routes. From decades of data, they propose a grammar. Migration paths must follow the river valleys through the Hindu Kush. This seems a constraint born of necessity: water, pasture, passage. Then, a perturbation. An extreme drought desiccates the traditional valleys. The grammar's prediction would be migration failure or crisis. Instead, through licensed observations, GPS tracking, surveys, they document a community successfully using a forgotten high-altitude pass, violating the proposed rule. The sentences, the recorded paths, are admissible. They happened, were viable, and sustained the group. But they violated G. The must follow river valleys grammar is falsified. It was a common historical pattern mistaken for an immutable rule. The real grammar might be more abstract. Paths optimize for a function of water access, forage density, and travel cost within physiological tolerances. This is a different, more flexible constraint family. In a laboratory, falsification manifests when a believed conservation law, a grammar, is tested in a new regime. If, after meticulous experimentation, a quantity is not conserved in repeatable, low-uncertainty sentences, the conservation grammar is falsified for that domain. It may be downgraded to an approximate rule for lower energies. License consequences. The firewall's administrative action. When a proposed grammar fails, we do not argue, rationalize, or believe harder. We execute a protocol to maintain the integrity of our knowledge ledger. 1. Scope narrowing. The most frequent action. The universal license of the grammar is retracted and reissued as a limited, local, or conditional grammar. We state, this constraint holds for windows with property X, for example, non-relativistic speeds, classical scales, certain material phases, but not universally. This is not defeat, it is precision. Newtonian mechanics is a local grammar relative to the wider grammars of relativity and quantum theory. 2. Retirement. If the grammar fails even in its previously established domain upon re-audit with better instruments, or is founded on a fundamental misconception, it is retired. It is moved from the active laws archive to the historical models archive, recognized as a useful but ultimately inaccurate stepping stone. 3. Archival as artifact. Sometimes a grammar is exposed as a pure artifact of measurement or reconstruction. For instance, a constraint arising from sensor saturation or an unchecked algorithmic assumption in data processing. This is not a grammar of nature at all, but a grammar of the tool. It is archived as such, with explicit warnings. The within uncertainty clause, a precision tool, not a loophole. The clause within uncertainty delta in G phi equals 0 is essential. It acknowledges we never have perfect sentences. Every phi and its derivatives carry an uncertainty budget. Checking grammar means checking if G phi is consistent with 0 given the propagated uncertainty delta G. If G phi equals 0.1 plus or minus 0.2, it is admissible. If G phi equals 0.1 plus or minus 0.01, it is a violation. This quantitative discipline prevents us from falsely falsifying a true grammar due to measurement error, and this prevents us from accepting a false grammar by hiding behind large, unquantified errors. Grammar versus metagrammar, a foreshadowing. A distinction must be noted. A grammar, like Maxwell's equations, is a constraint on sentences. A metagrammar is a constraint on grammars themselves, a rule for what kinds of constraints are allowable. For example, all fundamental grammars must be Lorentz invariant is a metagrammatical constraint. It filters candidate grammars G. We will build to this. For now, we hold focus on the first-order grammar. The epistemic skill, the grammar interrogation checklist. The skill you gain is grammar stress testing. You now possess a formal checklist for any proposed law of nature. 1. Formulation. Can it be stated as a constraint family G acting on phi and its derivatives, the jet. 2. Triunity. Does it constrain omega, k, and v jointly, not in isolation? 3. Perturbation prediction. What specific stability behavior does it predict if the system is slightly pushed out of grammaticality? 4. Falsification condition. What specific observation, an admissible violating sentence, would definitively falsify it? 5. Scope. What is its currently licensed domain of applicability? 6. Uncertainty protocol. How is the uncertainty delta G calculated from the underlying sentence uncertainties? This checklist is your shield against seduction by elegant mathematics or authoritative pronouncement. It forces epistemic engineering. Application. The pitfall of curve fitting. Consider common curve fitting. You collect data points, sentences, and find a 10th order polynomial that fits them perfectly. Is this a grammar? Almost certainly not. First, it lacks a clear interpretation as a constraint on derivatives related to omega or k by v. It is mere numerical interpolation. Second, and decisively, it will catastrophically fail under perturbation. Change a condition slightly, and new data will not lie on that polynomial. It has no stability prediction. It is a description of a pile, not the grammar of a world. The firewall's demand for perturbation stability filters out such empty laws instantly. The bridge to the next peril. We have defined grammar and its test, but a vast, subtle failure mode looms. How do we stop ourselves from inventing fake grammar? Not just mistaken grammar, but elaborate, self-consistent, mathematically beautiful constraint families that have no binding connection to reality. Grammar that is so under-constrained and flexible, it can be tuned to fit any pile of sentences by adding hidden variables, adjustable parameters, or epicycles. This is the danger of inferential collapse, where the power of our mathematical language lets us invent grammars that are unfalsifiable within a given scope. This leads us to the constraints on grammar discovery itself, the rules for rulemaking. That is our next step. Summary: the firewall function of grammar. We have defined grammar as the constraint family G that distinguishes a lawful world from a pile of sentences formalized as G phi equals 0 or less than or equals 0 within delta star. It constrains the triunity of omega, k, and v jointly. Energy, as a coherence tally, diverges when grammar is violated, signaling an inadmissible configuration. The explicit prediction is stability under perturbation. The explicit falsification is the emergence of admissible, violating sentences. The license consequences are scope narrowing or retirement. This firewall function is critical. It provides the filter between observed correlation and causal constraint. It prevents science from accumulating a zoo of pseudo-laws that are merely descriptions of local setups. It enforces the discipline that a true rule must govern not only what we have seen, but what we will see under novel conditions. Carry this skill forward. When you encounter a claimed law of nature, do not first ask if it is elegant or widely believed. Ask for its chi, its perturbation predictions, its falsifiers, and its license scope. This is the discipline that keeps knowledge sane, rigorous, and anchored in reality. Salam, and peace be upon you.